Welcome to Testify. Today we take a look at the book of 1 Thessalonians. Let's begin. At the church in Thessalonica, Paul and Silas began telling people the good news, and after a short period of time, a large number of both Jewish and Greek people gave their allegiance to Jesus, and a church was formed there. Trouble was brewing when Paul's announcement of the risen Jesus, as the true Lord, led to local opposition. The Christians in Thessalonica were accused of defying Caesar by proclaiming the King Jesus. As a result, Paul and Silas were persecuted and forced to flee from Thessalonica. Paul writes this letter to reconnect with them after receiving a report from Timothy that the Thessalonian Christians were doing more than well. Paul begins chapter 1 by giving thanks and celebrating the Thessalonians' faith, their love for others, and their hope in Jesus despite persecution. He goes on to retell the story of their conversion, looking back at how they once believed in idols, honoring the Greek and Roman gods. Paul says that they turned away from idols to serve the living and true God and are waiting for the coming of God's Son from heaven. In a city like Thessalonica, giving your allegiance to the God of Israel and King Jesus came at a cost: isolation from your neighbors and hostility from family. But for these Christian Thessalonians, the overwhelming love of Jesus and the hope of his return made it all worth it. Paul continues on to retell the story of his mission in Thessalonica, and the dear friendships that he formed with the people. Paul reminds us that the essence of Christian leadership is not about power and influence. It is about healthy relationships and humble, loving service. Paul reminds them that he simply came to serve and love them in the name of Jesus. Paul reflects on their common persecution. Just as Jesus was rejected and killed by his own people, so Paul is persecuted by his fellow Jews, and the Thessalonians too face hostility from their Greek neighbors. Paul draws a strange comfort from knowing that, together, their suffering is a way of participating in the story of Jesus' own life and death. Paul shares the anguish that he experienced when he heard of the Thessalonians' hardships after he and Silas left. He had sent Timothy to support them and see how they were doing. To his joy, Timothy discovered that they were actually going well. They were still faithful to Jesus, full of love for God and neighbor, and longing to see Paul as much as he longed for them. Paul prays that God will grow the Thessalonians' capacity to love, strengthen their commitment to holiness, and fix their hope on the return of King Jesus. Paul challenges the people to live a life that's consistent with the teachings of King Jesus. This means, first of all, a serious commitment to holiness and sexual purity. In contrast to the sexually destructive culture around them, they are to follow Jesus' teaching about experiencing sexual relations within a committed marriage covenant relationship. God takes sexual misbehavior seriously, as it dishonors and destroys people as well as their dignity. Paul instructs them that Christians should be known in the city as reliable people who work hard. This is not only to make money, but also so that they can have resources to provide for themselves, and generously share with those in need. After this, Paul addresses a number of questions the Thessalonians had raised about the future hope of Jesus' return. Some Christians in the church had recently died, most likely killed as martyrs, and their friends and family were wondering what their fate would be when Jesus returned. Paul makes it clear that, despite their grief and loss, not even death can separate Christians from the love of Jesus. When he returns as king, he will call both the living and the dead to himself. Paul talks about the arrival of King Jesus. He too will be greeted by a delegation of his own people, who will meet the Lord in the air, as they welcome and escort him back to his world, where he will establish his kingdom of justice and peace. Paul warns that Jesus will return as king one day, and confront this kind of injustice. Followers of King Jesus should live in the present, as if that future is already here. Despite the darkness of human evil surrounding them, they should stay aware, as the light of God's kingdom dawns here on earth as it is in heaven. Paul prays that God will permeate their lives with his holiness, setting them apart to be wholly devoted and blameless, until the return of King Jesus. 1 Thessalonians reminds us that the response of Jesus' followers to such hostility should always be love, meeting opposition with grace and generosity. This way of life is motivated by hope in the coming kingdom of Jesus, which has already begun with his resurrection from death. Holiness, love, and future hope, that's what 1 Thessalonians is all about. That brings us to the end of the book of 1 Thessalonians. Thanks for listening.